Here. We have a nice number here this morning, and I appreciate it. We're going to be doing our final lesson for Galatians 1 and 2 this morning, and next Sunday will be Focus Sunday with a special theme for our Bible class, and then the following Sunday, Lane will begin a discussion of the next two chapters in Galatians. And then in November, Michael Robinson will finish our study of Galatians in the last two chapters during the month of November. If we have time this morning, I want to move over and pick up just one verse at the end of Galatians 2. And share some thoughts on that. If we don't, we'll just dispense with that anyway, and this will conclude our study of the first two chapters. In the second chapter of Galatians, at the beginning of the chapter, Paul describes his visit to the church to Jerusalem to talk about what we often refer to as the Jerusalem Conference. And we're actually going to spend the majority of our time this morning in Acts the 15th chapter, which gives us a little better picture of that visit, what it was about, and the results of that. But there are a couple of things I want us to look at in Galatians 2 before we turn over to Acts. Beginning in verse 1, 14 years later, when I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas, I took Titus also. And then we're going to skip down to verse 3. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. This really gives us the background of why Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem and why the Jerusalem conference took place. In the Galatian letter, Paul makes specific mention that he took Titus with him. If we look at the book of Acts, we do not find Titus' name mentioned anywhere in that book, and we do not find it mentioned with respect to the Jerusalem conference in Acts 15. In Acts 15 it says Paul and Barnabas and others with them. I make a specific point of that because there's been much said about Titus being with them and why Titus was with them. There are many scholars, and I would say, in fact, most, who think that Titus went with Paul, or Paul took Titus with him, for the specific purpose of testing his belief that circumcision was not necessary to be a Christian. That holding to the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, was not necessary to be a Christian. And that is really what was at issue when they went, was the question of whether or not. Paul makes the point in the Galatian letter that there were those who came in among us, and he calls them false teachers, to basically, it's not his words, mine, but I believe it's an accurate description, to cause trouble. That they came there to cause trouble. And yet we know from the book of Acts that whether or not you had to follow the law of Moses, and whether or not you had to specifically to be circumcised because of the symbol or what that represented to the Jewish people, And this was really the focus of what was going on there. I think that one of the things that we want to do as we look at this particular passage and as we look at Acts 15 is say, but why does that matter to us today? What difference does it make? One of the questions that I think that we need to deal with and often have to deal with is when someone becomes a Christian, how much like me do they have to be? How much of the things that I've carried through my life and always believed need to be imposed in order for us to be Christians? You know, there are so many things in our life as Christians that are just natural to us. They've always been there. Sometimes it becomes awfully hard to distinguish between those things that are just part of our routine from history or our traditions and how much of it is actually biblical-based requirements that we need to meet. And this is the fundamental question that's before them. But as we go through this lesson today, I'd like us to keep that in mind, that we need to look at what's required by Scripture and what do we do because of tradition. If you look back, and I would dare say that most of us who have been Christians for a long time, who grew up in the church as many of us did, that we can remember times within the fellowships where we were, where we had great conflict over small questions. One of the questions that I distinctly remember, you'll remember things different for me, different place than I was, but one of the things that I distinctly remember is, do we have to have communion before the sermon? Or do we have to have communion after the sermon? Folks, people have divided over that question. It has become an extremely sore issue. Another thing over the years, how many songs do you sing before communion? And how many after communion and before the lesson? Little things like that. When I was talking with Barbara about this past week, and I said, I don't think I want to go there. Those are just nitpicking things. And Barbara said, but that's what divides us. It's nitpicking things. I would say that the things that were troubling the Jews at this time were more than nitpicking, or perhaps not that much more than nitpicking. So I want us to look at that this morning, and I'd like us to turn over to Acts 15, which I think gives us a little better picture. And before we look at those first verses in Acts 15, I'm going to go back to Paul's comment in the Galatian letter when he says, not even Titus, who was a Greek, was required to be circumcised. It was an important question to them in the day. It was a critically important question to the Jews of the day. I would note for us that in Acts the 16th chapter, shortly after this Jerusalem conference, when Timothy joined Paul and Barnabas, what was the first thing he did? He took Timothy and had him circumcised, because of the Jews that were going to be in the area where they were working. I make that point because I want us to see that sometimes, even though they're going to make the argument this is not necessary, it was not required, it's another thing that we have to live with today. That sometimes things are expedient that help us to avoid having conflict. I don't think there's any question, but Paul's actions with Titus was to make a point. And an important point. But with Timothy, there was also a recognition when they were working with Jews that it may be helpful. It was not anything wrong with circumcision. There was no reason not to have him circumcised if he wanted to. Simply wasn't required. But he did so because it was the right thing to do in order to avoid conflict and controversy that they did not need to have within the church. And again, I think this is something that we as Christians today ought to always keep in mind, that there are times when we do things not because they're required, but we still should do them because it is a good thing to do in terms of the relationships that we have within our fellowship and the relationships that we have with people that we want to reach out to. That said, Acts version of what took place. Some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, unless you were circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. So that lays out the question that they were dealing with. There were Jews who came to Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas were working, where they were not requiring circumcision and were not requiring them to follow the law of Moses. And they said, if you're not circumcised and follow the teachings of Moses, can't lose sight of the fact that there's two things here. Circumcision was the symbol of the law of Moses. Always was. But the other thing was that circumcision by itself was not what they were looking for. They were looking for the symbol, yes. But they were also looking to bind it to the law of Moses. In other words, I would submit to you this morning, they were looking to make them Jews. I think that it behooves us to keep passages like this in mind. If we were going to make a current day application of that statement, what do we want? We want people to look like us, act like us, and follow our practices. If you today were to travel into many foreign countries and walk into a Church of Christ, you might see things considerably different than we do them. And it's not because they're wrong. It's because that their practices, their habits, their rituals, their customs are different than ours. Give me 1 second and I'm coming to you. If you walk into a Church of Christ in inner cities, in many places in this country, and we have the same problems. Yes?
I was actually studying on circumcision the other day with my best friend. And, you know, a lot of people thought that these Jews were trying to bind these Gentiles to the law of Moses. But circumcision didn't originate with the law of Moses. It originated with Abraham 430 years prior to the law of Moses. So what they were actually advocating is that you could not belong to God unless you were circumcised. They weren't not necessarily trying to create them to be Jews, but they were trying to say you can't be a child of Abraham and belong to God and be in that family unless you are circumcised. And Genesis 17 talks about how, the death penalty was implemented if you weren't circumcised, every male child or servant or anyone working in their country. So it goes far beyond just the law of Moses. It went all the way back to Abraham.
In fact, he makes reference to Genesis 17 chapter. Genesis 17 is where we actually find circumcision instituted. That was the beginning of circumcision. Abraham at that time was 99 years old. It was before Isaac was born. And when Ishmael was 13 years old. And it was a requirement, but we still come back to the point, it's making you like us. And that was what they're looking at here, is you need to follow what we have always followed in the past. And one of the fundamental questions here is, was the law of Moses still applicable? And the answer is going to be, it is not. And as we read through the 15th chapter of Acts, it's very clearly stated that it is not. But their question was, well, actually there wasn't a question. Their statement is, unless they are circumcised, unless, according to the custom taught by Moses, and unless they follow that law of Moses, then they can't be Christians. One of the things that they were dealing with at that time is the Jews, in fact, believed that they were the chosen people. And they were for many centuries. The Jews did not accept the Gentiles as someone that could be Christians. One of the things that Peter is going to address as we go through our lesson today is the fact that God said, yes, they are. They can be Christians. And it's the thing that they're dealing with. The Gentiles, the church in Antioch, they sent Paul and Barnabas to Judea, to Jerusalem, for the specific purpose of answering the question, do the Gentiles have to become like Jews in order to be Christians? Do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to follow the law of Moses? And in verse 5, then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up. We're going to have the same statement again that we had at the beginning. The Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and must be required to obey the law of Moses. Again, this is a two-pronged statement that they're making. One is the symbol for Judaism. One is the symbol for being a child of Abraham. And the other is the law of Moses. They were not arguing that they only had to be circumcised. They're arguing that they have to follow the law of Moses. In other words, they are arguing, I would suggest, that you have to become a Jew in order to be a Christian. That was their argument. When we look at that then, there's a discussion that takes place. And we're not going to take time to read all of Acts 15 this morning, but I'm going to pick out what I think are some of the key parts and look at that. The discussion begins up in about verse 15, but we're going to go down to verse 19 in Acts 15. And this is James who's speaking, and I'm not clear whether this is James, whether this is James, the brother of Jesus, or James the apostle. But it was James. There are several Jameses mentioned in the New Testament. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from meat of strangled animals and from blood. For Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. James says, it's my judgment there are three things that we should impose. But he also says we should not make it difficult on those Gentiles who want to become Christians. In other words, we should not be imposing our traditions before they can become a Christian. That they should abstain from things polluted by idols, that they should abstain from sexual immorality. I'm going to go back to things polluted by idols and to blood, but I want to touch just briefly on sexual immorality first. As I go through the scriptures, both Old and New Testaments, one of the key things that our Lord condemned from the beginning of time through the entire New Testament was anything that involved sexual immorality. We think that we face a world today where sexual immorality is worse than it's ever been. And I'm going to agree it's bad. I am not going to agree that it's worse than it's ever been. If we go back through both the Old and the New Testament, there's plenty of evidence that sexual immorality has been a problem since the beginning of time and continues to be a problem today. Enough said that one of the things they said that James said we should ask them to abstain from is sexual immorality. Food polluted by idols. Idol worship was a major issue throughout much of biblical history. And the issue of food that had been polluted by idols was a problem for many, many people throughout the ages. It was taken as symbolic for a lot of things. The Apostle Paul writes in the 1 Corinthian letter in chapter 8 and deals specifically with food polluted by idols. And what he found, his conclusion is, the eating meat that may have been sacrificed to an idol or not eating it is not an issue. Eat it, it's not a problem. Don't eat it, it's not a problem. The problem is when it becomes a stumbling block for others. But Paul's conclusion was, and this was really, his conclusion was that that's not the issue. The issue is the influence it has on other people. James, in his argument here, is that because of the fact that food polluted by idols is an issue for us and for those around us, it's best to leave it alone. Because it's best just not to take part in that. We need to just leave that alone. The other is about eating blood or animals that are strangled. An animal that is strangled, the blood does not drain from it. Once the animal dies, the blood will not drain. And so really this is a single question. It's not two questions. The fact that the blood was still there. If we go back to Genesis, the 7th chapter, and the Lord's covenant with Noah, he specifically restricted them from eating blood or an animal that had its lifeblood still in it. Either way. So for the Jewish people from the time going back to the time of Abraham, before the law of Moses, and even before the law of Abraham, all the way back to Noah, there's been a prohibition against eating of blood or an animal that still had the lifeblood in it. This is something that has always been there and has always been restricted. But I think the more important question for us today is James says, it's his recommendation. And he said, and he begins this, it's my judgment, therefore. And this is not the final letter that's going to go out, although it really becomes the final letter. But he says, it's my judgment that this is what we should ask them not to do. And by that, we're talking about ask the Gentiles not to do as they become Christians. The things that are symbolic or ritualistic for their idol worship and idol practices, best to leave those alone. Need to stay away from sexual immorality, and need to tell them that they should not eat the blood or animals with the blood, the lifeblood still in them. So this was the discussion that they had, and it's the thing that it dealt with. I wanted to, in Genesis 9, I said 7 is for chapter 9, very quickly, you must not eat meat that has its blood still in it, is the actual language that we have in that passage. And again, this was part of their pagan idol worship. But it is also a restriction that God had placed on them literally from almost the beginning of time. And perhaps always from the beginning of time. This was the recommendation. And then from there, the letter goes out. The letter begins in verse 24 of chapter 15. I want us to look just at the first verse or two and then the very last verse of that letter. We have heard that some went out from us without our authorization and disturbed you. They're writing back to the Gentiles in Antioch. This is what we have heard, that some went out, but they were without our authorization. And they disturbed you, troubling your minds by what they said. So we all agreed to choose some men and send them to you, with our dear friends, Barnabas and Paul. This is what they're writing back and saying. And then they specifically list the things that we think we should not do. And when they finish, he says, you will do well to avoid these things. I would again come back to the statement that I made earlier. There are things here that they're imposing because they believe that that is exactly what God imposed. The not eating of blood, the not eating of animals with the lifeblood still in them. That they're suggesting, and I do not believe they're making this a requirement, that they not anything, and I just lost my train of thought, that food that has been presented to idols, a matter that is something that it's easier to leave it alone and not go there. It is more expedient to leave it alone and not go there. It is something that causes conflict, and we don't need to do things that cause conflict. So these were the things that they put in here. Now, I want us to go now back to Galatians. I lost my train of thought there for a minute. I had to get back in line. If we go down back to the end of that passage, beginning down in verse 9, James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave Barnabas and I the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and that they would go to the Jews. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. What we see that has taken place here is the church in Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas, and as far as we know, well, and Titus, we know from this letter, because there was a question that they had. Paul wanted to go because Paul wanted, this is now 14 years later, he wanted to make sure that what he was teaching was in line with what was being taught. And I'm not speculating, we find this in the scripture. He wanted to make sure that what he was teaching was in line with what was being taught in Judea or in Jerusalem. That he was not in conflict with what they were teaching. And they came to a conclusion. And Paul is the one who set it up. We all agreed. We had the right hand of fellowship. We parted as brothers who loved each other, who cared about each other, and who were satisfied that what they were doing and what we were doing was all consistent. That is so important as we go through life today in dealing with issues within the church, that we be able to understand and work together knowing that our teachings are consistent with the Holy Scriptures. And this is what the point that Paul is making. And they also made an agreement then that the apostles should continue to teach the Jews, and Paul and the group that was with Paul should continue to teach the Gentiles. I think that there's a message there that we sometimes overlook in not recognizing that not everybody is right for teaching this particular group or that particular group. There are things that I can do, people that I can work with, that some of you might not be able to. There are people that you may be able to work with that I may not be able to work with. There was a clear recognition that Paul's role, Barnabas' role, was working with Gentiles. And a clear recognition that Peter and the group that he was with, that their role was working with the Jews. They related to them. Paul related to the Gentiles. There are distinctions in how we relate to other people. And we need to remember that as we work together. When we send missionaries into foreign lands, we need to have people going who are prepared to relate to the people that they're going to be teaching. If we go and we cannot relate, we don't accomplish much. And frankly, there are preachers today who are very good preachers for us who would not fit well in some other congregations. There are preachers in congregations in other parts of the nation who probably would not fit well with us. Does that make them false teachers? Does not. But because of our personalities, because of our backgrounds, because of our customs and traditions, we relate differently to people, and they relate differently to us. And this is one of the things that they recognized as part of the Jerusalem conference, that the apostles would continue to relate well to the Jews, and that Barnabas and Paul and the others with them would relate well to the Gentiles. Before we close our lesson today, I want us to look at one other verse. Just going to touch on it briefly, but I want to make a point or two with it. In verse 11, chapter 2, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. But certain men came from James. He used to eat with the... No, let me back that up. I read that wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he came to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Paul says, I confronted Peter because he was wrong. Why was Peter wrong? Peter had been eating with Gentiles, not thinking anything about it. People that he knew and who knew him came to town. And Peter backed away from that group that he was eating with. He was afraid to be seen with the Gentiles. Folks, we have people that we're comfortable with. We can do anything with and feel comfortable. There are other people where we're not nearly as comfortable, but we must, in our life as Christians, be able to interact with Christians of all races, of all cultures, of all backgrounds, and not be ashamed to be seen with someone just because a bunch of you show up and know who I am and know my background. If I understand what Paul has written here about the Apostle Peter, the very issue was not wanting to be seen with Gentiles, but being very comfortable eating with them as long as there were no other Jews there. I believe that it's a natural thing for us to want to shrink back from people who are different than we are when we're together with one another and people that we know and who know us. Paul's instruction Paul's statement here about Peter was that attitude is wrong. And I think that's an important thing for us to recognize and to understand. We're out of time this morning. It will be your lesson, and next week will be Focus Sunday, and then the following week after that, Lane will be teaching.